At midnight, October the 4th, as thousands of howitzers and rocket projectors opened up all throughout the nation, as the external components rushed across the border in their various prongs of invasion, the Trojan shock forces all throughout the nation, including within this South Central invasion sector, had likewise emerged from their various CCP regime properties upon which they had been based for all of these previous years, decades, as they had built up their manpower and materiel throughout these various farms, closed down businesses and structures, warehouses, solar and wind farms, and more, as the artillery pieces, not just across the nation, but specifically within the various battles that were beginning throughout it, including that which was occurring in the Waco battle just north of the embattled 3 Corps within Fort Hood, as the 143rd Infantry Regiment, which was an airborne infantry regiment of the Texas National Guard, had been mobilized to defend the Waco area, to be based at the Waco Regional Airport, as units from within the 68th PLA Group Army, which had been broken up with roughly half of their forces partaking in the battle that was now erupting in Fort Hood, with the other half spread out throughout the Waco area and a bit beyond, as besides the artillery battalion within this particular battle map belonging to the 13th Light Armor Brigade, itself part of the 288th Light Infantry Division, was spread out in a crescent off the map from I-35 to positions within the northeastern quadrant just out off the Waco regional map. The 13th Light Armor Brigade's artillery, consisting of PCL 181s, which were truck-based PLL-01 155 millimeter howitzers for a high degree of mobility, had opened fire as various armed civilians began emerging from their residences, many fleeing the area as the screams of scores of aircraft had flown overhead, and with the resulting communications and grid down, the entire nation of America was waking up to the harsh realities that were unfolding, including the enormous eruption of blasts as thousands upon thousands of munitions began to land from land-based, sea-based, and air-based delivery platforms. And this even included cruise and tactical ballistic missiles fired from the various missile forces of the coalition, primarily from the Chinese Eastern Theater Command brigades, which had been stationed in Mexico, as well as even a Trojan brigade, the 616th, operating as a Trojan shock force just to the east of Austin, as there was even a battle raging there, as battles raged all up and down the I-35 corridor from Laredo to Oklahoma City within this South Central invasion sector and beyond, as the Trojans prepared to seize control of all of the key nodes to allow for the external invasion prongs to hurriedly and easily pass through their AOs, or areas of operation, as they rapidly emerged from their CCP properties, which were all located within immediate vicinity of their various objectives. And Waco was no exception, as much of the PLA 68th Group Army's heavy armored strength, as far as their maneuver elements, were located within the Fort Hood battle that was simultaneously occurring The 38th Infantry Brigade, the 8th Independent Brigade, and the 288th Light Infantry Division, which was broken down into its base elements as the 3rd Light Infantry Regiment, the 14th Light Infantry Regiment, and the 13th Light Armor Brigade, as again, most of which was located off the map. However, their CCP property upon which their artillery battalion began on was located just to the east of northern Waco itself. As the clock had already passed 12 a.m. on day one of the invasion, the various ISR assets were already now airborne, including those launched from Trojan CCP properties with primitive runways constructed for their use. As there was a WZ-7 high-altitude recon drone allocated to this specific AO. There was also a CH-4A armed high-altitude reconnaissance drone, and also another that was operating watching the southeastern quadrant of the battlefield. There were also 5 Wing Lung combat drones in lieu of aircraft, as most of the coalition's aircraft had been allocated early on with dealing with various military installations and the larger cities, as Waco was a medium city and there were more pressing targets early on. Despite the importance of Waco to the overall invasion, the drones were seen as adequate enough because the original target of this specific portion of the invasion was a single infantry regiment, an airborne infantry regiment in the form of the 143rd from the National Guard. However, fleeing military units from Fort Hood, which would be broken up as they fled, as they lacked any military networks, GPS, or satellite-based communications, and would have to go old school, as the saying goes, and utilize maps and compasses to try to make contact with the 143rd, as they were fully aware that the 143rd had been posted in order to move to defend the Waco Regional Airport, which was the main target of the Red Chinese forces in this particular battle, apart from their control of I-35 itself. As the city of Waco itself was not seen as of dire importance apart from its highway and its airport infrastructure, including the rapidly captured TSTC airport, which was the Texas State Technical College Airport, which, in order to fund its operations, had not only received funding from the central regime of the nation from its FAA, but also had leased out portions of its airport infrastructure to private interests, including defense and even also the regime in the form of use of military aircraft, as it was a quote-unquote public-private partnership in many cases. The headquarters battalion and independent support battalion, as the HQ was an independent battalion and not part of any brigade or larger units, these two battalions within the 288th Light Infantry Division would rapidly seize control of the TSTC airport and begin to convert these facilities into a forward operations base, while their subunits, like the 3rd Light Infantry Regiment, the 14th Light Infantry Regiment, and even also the 13th Light Armor Brigade, which was busy handling other issues off the map, such as 2 of its light tank battalions deployed to guard a stretch of I-35 just off the map, as well as its other units spread out to press out and away from Waco to begin to clear these areas, as due to the nation's failed border policies, many areas, especially within the South Central invasion sector as a whole, had a number of armed civilian militia-like forces that were increasingly well organized, as well as even smaller community defense type groups, as the nation's communication system and grid and more, anything that was satellite based as well, was in full disarray. These forces begin to emerge moments after the takedown of the grid, the telecom, the net, and also satellite-based data transfers, satellite internet, and satellite phones. And as a result of this, had begun to emerge in different groupings, as this was spotted not only by the coalition's satellites, including the Chinese and Russian military satellites, as well as their high-altitude reconnaissance drones and even spy planes in certain areas. These forces would be engaged rapidly, even before the American military units escaping the battle at Fort Hood would begin to show up, as the fighting at Fort Hood was quite severe, and many of the forces at Fort Hood would be completely destroyed within the first 4 hours of the invasion, although the battle would last until noon on day one, or a full 12 hours. The first 4 hours would be essentially the most critical time within this battle, as the units that were out in the training areas were the only ones that were really in any position to fight back or resist against the PLA and Russian army forces, as they would do their best to resist under the circumstances they faced. They would ultimately be crushed by the PLA as well as the Russian army forces. And certain Russian battalions would even begin to hotly pursue them, with an armored battalion and a mechanized infantry battalion arriving merely a few hours after the American scattered remains of the 409 Cav and the 91st Brigade Engineering Battalion and the 2-3 ACR, or the 2nd Squadron of 3rd ACR, would now be fighting as mixed units as they arrived and ran a gauntlet of fire, with very few making it to rendezvous with the 143rd in the downtown area itself. The only real military force apart from those arriving that would be fully capable of mounting any sort of serious defense. And they would last a relatively long amount of time, as they would hold out for nearly 2 full days in the downtown, utilizing certain facilities to their fullest advantage, such as multi-story, heavily steel and concrete reinforced parking garages that, even with shells crashing down upon them, as well as rockets, including the later to be fired powerful 300mm rockets coming from the PHL-03 battalion within the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade within the 68th PLA Group Army that was down in Fort Hood as well as here. These forces would hang on and cling to their perimeter defense for dear life. And as they would take cover in these very hardened facilities, the onslaught of the powerful artillery, including the rocket artillery strikes, would reduce many of the top floors of these structures to complete abject ruination, while preserving on the bottom levels many of the vehicles that had the proper clearance to make it within these garages, as they had a certain roof clearance for certain vehicles, and some would be able to enter while others would not. Those that would not would be completely destroyed, although they would preserve some of their vehicles for a time, at least until the city had been pulverized to a point where there were no more places within which they could safely store their vehicles. Some of the first moves that would be made would be the 38th Infantry Brigade sending its mechanized infantry battalion positioned across from the Waco Regional Airport, as well as its headquarters battalion and armored battalion within this particular area, with its other units, including another mechanized infantry battalion, combat engineer battalion, mechanized infantry battalion, and its artillery battalion, leaving them in the southwestern quadrant of the battle space while they would move to establish positions within this relatively large Waco Regional Airport to become a large FOB later on in the fighting. As the Air Defense Battalion, equipped with the potent HQ-11s, would send one of their companies along with these forces to set up their air defense assets within the Waco Regional Airport. Others would stay within the Willow Grove area and end up fighting off some armed civilians that would be fleeing from heavy artillery shelling that would completely saturate the southwestern portions of the city, as the combat engineers and mechanized infantry would be fighting the very soon arriving scattered American military forces in conjunction with fighting off bands of armed civilian combatants, as in reactionary armed civilians that attempted to fight straight off the bat. And no sooner, again, had the communications and everything else relating to satellite and internet and even redundant communications such as radios due to the electronic jamming occurring from the Electronic Warfare Battalion within the 68th Group Army's Signals Regiment, these forces would emerge again from their homes, many of them jumping into vehicles, including trucks, which would become technicals in a way, as they would be full of men with rifles in the beds of these trucks, and others would quickly try to make Molotov cocktails and fight back in any way they could. There would even be a few rare cases of some of these reactionary armed civilians, especially that there was a high proportion of veterans that when they ETS'd from the Army, they stayed in the area, including within Waco, and knew how to operate a rocket-propelled grenade. There would be an instance where they would get a hold of some of these weapons, and it would aid them a bit in their fight against these invasion forces. However, at the beginning in the invasion phase, these instances would be extremely rare, but they did happen on occasion. And as the partisan elements that would grow out of the invasion phase when the war turned to an occupation and colonization effort by the CCP regime, the Americans would get better and better equipment as time would go on, as they would pick softer targets such as supply convoys and certain outposts and work their way up from there. As they would get better and better equipment, although their casualties would be heinous, they would eventually gain more and more experience for those that were refined like fine gold through the fires of war. As the armed civilians began to emerge with weapons in hand, the armed civilians, especially those adjacent to I-35, needed to be eliminated immediately, as I-35 was to become the prime invasion corridor for the external components moving up from Mexico, as they needed to get deep inland and get to Kansas, where they were to fan out and assist all the other Trojans that were deep inland doing much of the heavy lifting, as the saying went. So any enemy forces that were adjacent to the major invasion routes, including I-35, but also I-25, I-10, and other routes, needed to be eradicated as quickly as possible, as even to destroy a few of the logistical or administrative vehicles of these group armies could hold up their progress for hours, and this could absolutely not be tolerated by the PLA or the rest of the coalition forces involved. The first instance of combat within the Waco battle, as in force-on-force contact, was between a light mechanized infantry battalion against roughly 400 armed civilian combatants just outside of Waco proper in its outermost suburbs, as these forces, again, could possibly become a threat to the invasion route. Although the shock and awe of the invasion had thrown many into a state of total surprise and bewilderment at what was going on, this needed to be exploited to its fullest, as this was to be a rapid campaign, and there was to be no letting up when it pertained to the coalition forces invading the nation. They needed to achieve their victory in a rapid speed and pace. And all in all, this was to be a 4-day-long invasion, and timetables were strict. And again, the surprise had to be exploited to its absolute fullest. When these armed civilians began to emerge naturally from their homes with weapons in hand, as PLA forces could be heard rolling through local areas, and many spotted them and began yelling frantically about it, alerting many to their presence, as well as the screaming of enemy aircraft overhead. They emerged ready for a fight, but it was a fight that they really weren't prepared for in terms of being organized at this point in the invasion, being coordinated, having the right weaponry, as they lacked any serious anti-tank weaponry apart from Molotovs, which they had to get really close to use as it was a hand-thrown implement. And they just simply were not ready for the scope and scale of the combat as it would unfold. As the PLA forces from the 3 different artillery battalions, the artillery battalion of the 288th Light Infantry Division with its PCL-181 truck-mounted howitzers, which was part of its 13th Light Armor Brigade, as well as the artillery battalion of the 38th Infantry Brigade and its towed PL-66 howitzers, and the 122 millimeter rocket artillery of its PHL-181s, which were the truck-mounted 122 millimeter rocket artillery systems, began wreaking havoc upon the city, as the PCL-181s were the truck-mounted 155 millimeter howitzers and began to rain down shells on armed civilians wherever they emerged from, as shown in this animation illustration, as they began upon their CCP regime properties. And for the most part, most of the artillery forces would not have to do very much movement, at least at this point in time, although some would be moving, like the PLL-66 152 millimeter towed howitzers that would shell large portions of Waco into complete abject ruination and rubble, as depicted within this illustration here, as they're on top of a hilltop overlooking the river and also the southwestern end of Waco, as these forces are lobbing shells with some CH-901A loitering munitions flying around the area, seeking out targets on their AI target-seeking mode, as the combo of armed combat drones equipped with missiles for the air-to-ground role, as well as the loitering munitions and the heavy use of artillery, would more than make up for there being essentially no piloted aircraft utilized in this specific battle for this specific instance of combat. The combat would be heavy, and the artillery strikes themselves, including the later to come 300 millimeter strikes that would slam downtown, along with the 122 millimeter strikes from the PHL-81s, not to be confused with the PCL-181s, would completely leave this city as a heap of ruins, as depicted here within this picture, as the shelling and rocketing would be feverishly intense and would annihilate many tens of thousands of the city's inhabitants, as 155 millimeter shells, 122 millimeter rockets, and 152 millimeter shells would later be joined again by 300 millimeter rockets. But the men of the 143rd would put up an heroic stand against the invasion forces. Even though they would eventually be defeated, the fact that they would stand and fight as long as they would show that they had a measure of resolve and would attempt to give their all and sacrifice everything to put up their defense. But the Trojan shock armies that were emerging were simply far too powerful for anything the defenders could realistically do at this time, as they again had been caught completely off guard, were totally surprised, and had lost all communications and the ability to coordinate and hold their forces together with any measure of organization as a result, as communications became a word-of-mouth method of keeping others informed of orders and relaying information. It would become exceedingly difficult for the forces to stay together unless they bunched up in groups, and when they did that, they were easily picked off by artillery, by the armed combat drones and their ability to launch various air-to-ground missile systems, as well as the loitering munitions, which were kamikaze drones themselves, as well as the other ground-based fire, such as that of the potent Type 96B main battle tanks that equipped the armored battalion of the 38th Infantry Brigade, as well as the two armored battalions of the 8th Independent Brigade. Again, these forces were, generally speaking, on the lighter end of the 68th PLA Group Army's forces, but they did have some potent maneuver elements besides their lighter forces, which were still plenty adequate for fighting against a light infantry force as originally intended to fight against not only the armed civilians that were known to be congregating in the area as militia forces in many cases, as there were even a few known militia compounds in the area, not all that dissimilar from Mount Carmel, but these were more fortified as such, as installations for these armed infantry groups and civilian armed mutual defense organizations that had come together as a result of the current times that they were living in, making them willing to also put up a fight and try to defend as best as they could against the invasion that was now unfolding. The fighting was intense, and as the first combat erupted with the mechanized infantry forces within their ZBL-08 or ZBD-08 wheeled infantry fighting vehicles, armor personnel carriers, and even their anti-tank instead of a fire support company armed with the WZ-550 anti-tank systems, which were equipped with 4 HJ-09 anti-tank missiles apiece, had rolled in to smash these forces. As we go to the map, essentially, just outside of Waco, this was I-35. Within this map, this is a 1 mile by 1 kilometer map in total scale. Within this map is an armed combat drone, a Wing-Loong 2 armed combat drone equipped with its air-to-ground missile systems, as the Wing-Loong 2 could carry up to 12 air-to-ground weapons consisting of different missile types or even rockets, and also even dropped munitions as well. The loitering munitions, CH-901As, again produced in freakish quantities and were seemingly ubiquitous and could be fired 48 at a time from a TEL-like system. The dedicated combat drone elements within the headquarters forces that belonged to the Independent Headquarters Battalion, upon them having moved into the TSTC airport and captured it, had fired these drones a very short distance, and due to the short distance involved, they had a very long loiter time, and they were set on AI targeting mode, and began to pick off various vehicles that equipped these armed civilian elements, as some of them were trying to flee the city, as so on the highway, many being destroyed because the highway was absolutely off limits to enemy forces of any type for the PLA. And the highway seizure to prevent not only escapes from the city, as this would totally cut the city off from escape to the north via I-35, but also to control the entire corridor through this key node, which was Waco, was of the utmost importance to the PLA forces involved. Within this particular map, within this 1 mile by 1 kilometer segment, there are 4 mechanized infantry companies belonging to this battalion that are operating here, and the rest of their companies are operating in the south, including the 2 additional mechanized infantry companies, the anti-tank company with their WZ-550 vehicles, as well as the headquarters company, which is responsible for the command and logistics and administrative elements of this battalion. As these forces advanced into the area, one company was moving down this road right here, while another company, its combat elements visible, its 3 combat platoons with its headquarters platoon off map, including with this company moving in a single file line down this road, had moved through the back behind all of these homes. These homes were more upscale, and there was an apartment complex right here with its office and its different buildings. There were fast food restaurants here and a very large gas station near the highway entry and exit area. There were more middle-class type homes in this particular area of the battlefield, and there was a park with 2 basketball courts, 2 baseball diamonds that had dugouts within them. And as armed civilians began spreading the word that there were Chi-Coms operating in the area, as there were people that could recognize the markings on vehicles when they saw them, as unarmed civilians were generally left alone by the PLA, although not by the PAP, who tended to brutalize American civilians. The unarmed civilians would run and spread the news, while armed civilians would come out in groups or hide out in certain areas, such as these dugouts where they attempted to take cover from the attacking forces, while others tried to take fighting positions on the side of the rail embankment here. As again, on the modern battlefield, many occurrences are happening at roughly about the same time. Presenting them in a coherent order will be exceedingly difficult, although it will be attempted, as moving down from the general northwest to the southeast of the map, these 2 companies here were handling the outer cordon and sweep operation, as that ultimately was what was being done here in an attempt to surround these armed civilian combatants, cut off their escape, and completely destroy them. Although they would move through the battlefield and clear many of the buildings, certain other buildings would not be cleared due to the time involved. Some buildings would be completely liquidated by heavy fire so that they wouldn't have to be cleared, such as the buildings here being completely peppered with different types of ammunition being fired by the dismounted troops. Not all of the troops had been dismounted for this operation, with many staying within their vehicles to be held back as a mobile reserve of sorts to be utilized if needed, as the vehicles could bring them up closer and drop them off, although for the time being they had their dismounts move ahead, as they were fully aware that with all of these different hiding spaces throughout this particular area, there were definitely potential hiding spots whereby these vehicles could be ambushed by a kamikaze Molotov attack, as it would be a kamikaze attack because it would result in the person utilizing these systems being completely cut down by heavy fire. Although the ISR assets directed everything in this operation, and any enemy personnel that were hiding amid buildings outside could easily be seen, there were certain areas such as coniferous pines, such as wooded areas throughout this park and even behind the tracks, or even in the yards in some cases, where enemy personnel could actually lay in wait and actually run up and get close to the vehicles, hence the need to dismount these troops. So there was a swimming pool in the backyard of this home right here. There was one right here. These homes had been completely peppered, and it caused some of these armed civilians that had been hiding around them, in a few cases inside of them, to flee the area and head across the street to the park. There were others laying down in the prone position at the end of this parking lot, while others had hid out in these dugouts, or others running from this general area here as the vehicles were laying down heavy firepower against them, while others tried to take position behind the tracks, as they would soon be cut off by these vehicles going around the areas. There was another gas station right here, and also the armed Wingloom 2 drone would be firing its air-to-ground weapon systems in the form of HJ-10 anti-tank missiles at these vehicles that were full of armed combatants, as they had been seen by the high-altitude and the low-altitude quadcopter reconnaissance assets mounting their vehicles and moving north to either flee the city or move to another area, as these trucks, in some cases, were either filled with families that had all of their weapons on them, or they were filled with a group of neighborhood defense type people that banded together in their own mutual assistance groups or prepper groups and were spotted fleeing the area. In some cases, there were even militiamen that were banding together and getting in these vehicles to move up and out of the city, as again there were compounds throughout the area that they could try to flee to that were quasi-fortified. And these anti-tank missiles would hit and hit very hard, destroying many of these vehicles, while others were being lit up from the ZBL-08s or ZBD-08s coming down the street, led by their powerful infantry fighting vehicle versions of the ZBD-08s, which had a Gatling 35mm autocannon, which was extremely destructive and would shred a civilian vehicle to 1,000 pieces of scrap. And they would fire these down the street, shredding up some of these trucks, just with others just barely getting out of the way, as the rounds smacked into and blasted holes out of these homes and turned them into scrap, as the building materials flew in every which direction by the armor-piercing HE ammunition that equipped those vehicles. Very destructive. Also, the loitering munitions would come in and hit various targets, as well as these loitering munitions in particular going after enemies that were on the roof, as there were Americans that tried to get on the rooftop to see what was going on, or to get up there with Molotovs in an attempt to throw them at vehicles if they were going to come by, which they did not. They let the loitering munitions hit and destroy these armed civilian personnel before they even moved up, as this company here was coming up two different streets with its combat elements forming up, this being a platoon, 5 vehicles being a platoon, 5 being a platoon, with their headquarters platoon further back and off the map. Dismounts had already cleared these houses and were moving through the area to clear these other houses on this particular block, while the vehicles fired into this area along with the loitering munition strike, as these loitering munitions are equipped with the fragmentation warheads and were ideal for destroying armed civilians or military personnel that were in light-skinned vehicles, as they could shred a pickup truck to pieces, as well as groupings of personnel, as the fragmentation warhead was made to produce a lot of shrapnel to cut down personnel. And as these smashed into these personnel here, along with those on the roof, and even hitting some of the pickup trucks, they completely destroyed them and cut them down, as well as the fire from the vehicles, from the heavy machine guns, W85s, which were 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns. They fired into these groups, along with the infantry fighting vehicle versions firing their 35 millimeter Gatling main gun, their 35 millimeter Gatling autocannon, as well as also they had rail-mounted HJ-73Cs, which were a shorter range anti-tank missile but were highly destructive, and they could fire them as well into vehicles as well as groups of personnel. As this is a lengthy battle to explain, it will be continued in the following video, where the battle will be gone over in far more detail, as this was only a broad explanation of the occurrences happening on the map at the very beginning of the invasion. As only 25 minutes in, the PLA forces are beginning to make all of their main advances throughout the map, as their artillery provides them enormous firepower support, from 152 millimeter howitzers to 122 millimeter rocket artillery to 155 millimeter howitzers. These artillery battalions that belong to the different brigades in the division that were on the map, as in the rocket artillery of the 8th Independent Brigade, the 152 millimeter PLL 66 howitzers of the 38th Infantry Brigade, as well as the PCL 181s, not to be confused with the PHL 181s, of the 13th Light Armored Brigade, which is part of the 288th Light Infantry Division on the map. As the armed drones as well and the loitering munitions are released in massive numbers from their TEL-like systems, as well as the armed drones taking off, the Wing-Lung 2s, and even the CH-4A high-altitude armed recon drones, which can carry quite a heavy payload themselves, are all contributing to this battle that's occurring below. As armed civilians emerge, as they naturally would in a situation like this, after having lost all their communications and access to the internet, their telecom access, their TV and news information, their grid, the power grid itself, and water, and also anything related to satellite, they all were emerging at the sound, as the city was eerily silent at first, except for the rumbling of the PLA vehicles and the screaming of PLAAF and also VVS, which is the Russian Air Force aircraft overhead for the most part, although there were also Pakistani, Iranian, and even some North Korean Air Force assets and even Cuban Air Force assets operating in other parts of the country as well. But within the vast majority of the invasion, it was the PLAAF and the VVS that had contributed by far the most aircraft to this operation, the invasion of the USA. This battle will continue in the next video of this hypothetical invasion educational documentary series highlighting the very real fourth generation warfare doctrines and how they work within the scope of the invasion of America. Battle of Waco to be continued.